Hello and welcome to the History of Politics podcast. This week we're joined by Gareth Hughes, as ever. Hello, Mr. Hughes.
Hello, everybody. Hello.
We've also got Jonathan Webb, who is... there he is.
Who's just turned up with his lunch on the screen.
Turned up with his lunch, relaxed, ready for the semi-final. Mr. Hughes, over to you very briefly.
Yeah, I just thought I'd start off with the usual saying like and subscribe. Have I done it right?
No. You say like and subscribe. Don't forget to hit that notification bell. So every time you post a new video, you get notified.
Nice.
There you go. Back over to you, Mr. Braidwood.
We've been schooled there, haven't we? We've been absolutely schooled. Quick reminder again, although there's only two of us here right now, but no effing and jeffing. Our resident Irish history expert cannot join us today. Do you know why, sir?
I'm sorry, I was going to door at you. It's just us two. It's going to be a bit odd. It's like a stripped down version. It's not the after hours version of our podcast, is this? We haven't got our usual Irish expert. We haven't got Mrs. Hughes dressed as some kind of Victorian lady.
True.
I don't know. It's going to be more intimate, I feel.
Yeah.
More intimate.
More stripped down, like an acoustic session.
Yes. Like the MTV acoustic sessions from back in the day.
Yeah. But, okay, I've got a note here. Don't down, so we won't. Don't worry.
Okay, Mr. Webb, we'll refrain from that.
So this week, what we've got in store is our next semi-final of the World Cup of Prime Ministers. But I appear to be completely on my own now, but I'm going to continue talking. We've got our student mastermind challenger, who I'll let in a second, our usual book recommendations, and a song of choice again. Again, our hit rate is very, very low on our songs. They even took down the one last week, Mr. Hughes, as well.
You are kidding.
No,
that bit's been taken down as well.
That bit's been taken down. So even niche opera from the 18th century?
Yeah, 18th century opera.
Was taken down. So
this week isn't going to work either then, is it? So for season 2, we're going to have to come up with something completely different.
We're going to have to come up with something different. We're going to try, though. We're going to push on till the end. I've got a couple of facts for you.
If they're the same as the ones I've got. Because we obviously use the first or second page from Google every time we do it.
I don't think you're going to have exactly the same ones as me. So the first, I think you'll get the first one. Maybe the first one will be the same. So on this day, we're filming on or recording on the 14th of March. So Mothering Sunday.
Mothering Sunday.
Well
hello to all mothers out there.
Hello to all mothers out there. I say well done to all mothers out there. Yeah. Hello to all mothers out there. On this day in 1879, Albert Einstein was born.
Ooh.
Changed the humankind's view of the universe, instrumental, of course, in making the atomic bomb. He was a pacifist and did rail against the use of the atomic bomb against Japan. But when people think of a scientist, they think of Einstein, don't they? So he is a key figure of the 20th century. My other fact as well, on this day in 1960, Wilt Chamberlain set the NBA playoff record for 53 points in a game. He was playing for the Warriors against the Syracuse Nationals in Philadelphia. Do you remember Wilt Chamberlain, Mr. Hughes? Do you remember?
Yeah, we were good friends at school.
That explains a lot because he's dead now. He's quite an old chap. Well, he's obviously not old anymore, but he was the granny shot fame basketball player.
Oh yeah, of course.
And when you look into him, it's absolutely incredible. He is he holds all these records. So that's the 53-point playoff record, still holds that. 100 points in a game, still holds that as well. For a while, he had the three-throw record as well of 87.5% shots. But it's the great story that Malcolm Gladwell talks about that Wilt Chamberlain was a terrible three-throw point kind of scorer when he came to the NBA. And he changed to the granny shot, so kind of an underarm shot, and it jumped up from under 40% to over like 85% in one season. And then he went back to not shooting granny shot, shooting kind of overarm. And it's some really interesting stuff there about thresholds, why people do certain things, a bit about behavioral science as well. So it's definitely looking at that interview with Wilt Chamberlain as well. But absolutely incredible chap as well. He's 7 foot tall, I think he was, but he was quite graceful on the basketball court as well. So yeah, did you have those facts or not?
I did not have those facts.
I was surprised if you did.
Well, interesting. I did give an assembly earlier this week, and a section of it was based on basketball from one of Malcolm Gladwell's books, but not that particular story.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was about, you might remember, it's the one about the half court versus full court press. Remember that?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do remember that. Yeah.
There you go. Good little link. Right, I've got a few little facts. I've got some good ones on this day in history today. In 1743, so throwback to one of our previous episodes, and we're talking about Boston, first ever town hall meeting in Faneuil Hall. There you go. 1794, get this though. Eli Whitney patents a cotton gin. That's a good one.
That is good.
Also linked potentially today, depending on the selection of prime ministers. This day in 1801, Henry Addington becomes PM after William Pitt the Younger resigns. And on this day in 1812, Congress authorizes war bonds to fund the War of 1812.
Wowzers.
Hey, some good stuff.
I think I saw 3 of them. I nearly went for the Faneuil Hall one because just to kind of reminisce again about our time in Boston, but I thought I'd avoid that one. And there was another one about TR and trust busting, but I thought a bit boring for our usual listener as well. Good for our lower 6 students who actually study that. But without further ado, I think we should let you now.
Let's crack on.
Challenger. So I'm just going to let our next challenger in.
Hi.
Hello, George.
Hey, Langers.
How are you doing?
Very good, thank you. You are live, so remember no effing and jeffing. Not that you're prone to do that. We are going to play that music again to ramp up the tension. Good hit rate now. So without further ado, I'm going to play that music. I thought I was going to play that music, but is it even teed up, ready to go? For some reason, what's on my screen here? Let's have a look.
Well, don't you worry. I've got something you can be doing.
No, it's all good. We've got it.
You're good. Right, there we go.
I'm just going to stop sharing just to make sure I've shared the sound again.
Oh, it's smooth again, isn't it? This is absolutely smooth.
It's gone back to the first
week.
So pretend that didn't happen. Here we go. Awesome stuff.
Beautiful.
Excellent as ever. Slick. So we have our next challenger on. Just to remind you of the rules, our version of Mastermind has 10 specialist subject questions and then 10 general knowledge, history and politics questions to find out who our next, or I say our next, but our only Poppington sixth form Mastermind champion is. It is tight at the top of the leaderboard at the moment. In fact, it's a draw.
I was going to say, because we hadn't clarified that, is it an hour draw?
It is a draw because we're not going to take passes into account because we didn't make that clear earlier on in the series. So it's a draw at the moment. The score to beat, George, is 12. The score to beat is 12. So all to play for. Yeah. So without further ado, our next contestant, name?
George Langworthy.
Occupation?
Student.
And your chosen subject?
The history of Blur.
The history of Blur, taking us back to the 90s. Love it. We are without our usual esteemed quizmaster today, so I'm going to be taking over those duties. I don't think I'm going to do it as justice like Mr. Hall does. But Mr. Hughes, will you do me the honour of just noting down the score, please?
Of course.
Excellent stuff. So, without further ado, 10 specialist subject questions on the history of Blur. Number 1, the original name of Blur was Seymour. What was the inspiration for this name?
I'm not entirely sure. Pass.
It was based on J.D. Salinger's novella called Seymour: An Introduction. How many awards did Blur win at the 1995 Brit Awards?
4.
Correct, 4. Alex James, best known as the bassist of Blur, also has a passion for making what food?
Cheese.
Correct. Blur were linked with the Britpop movement. Name 2 of the other so-called Big 4 bands who were similarly linked with the movement.
Pulp. And Oasis.
Correct. Very good. Complete these lyrics from Blur's song 2. It got my head checked. I got my head checked by a
Jumbo Jet.
Correct. In 1998, Blur frontman Damon Albarn, along with Jamie Hewlett, formed what virtual band?
Gorillas.
Correct. Name this song from the first 2 lines. City dweller, successful fella, thought to himself, oops, I've got a lot of money.
Country House.
Correct. In 2009, Blur reunited with Graham Coxon and then embarked on a reunion tour. What was Coxon's role in the band?
Guitarist.
Correct. Stuart Maconie's official history of Blur is entitled what?
Pass, I'm not sure.
So it's 3,862 days. And final question, Parklife is often played before home matches at what London football team?
Chelsea.
It is Chelsea, correct.
Hey,
Good stuff there.
that is 8.
8, very, very strong start there. So George, tell us why Blur? What was the inspiration for that?
Well, they're my favourite band and I know a bit about them, so I thought it would be just quite an interesting subject to choose, really.
Are you going to play a bit of music? We get a little musical interlude.
I'll try it.
Just for our listeners out there, our thousands of listeners, we are going to try and attempt to play, as you can see on the screen here, song 2, which I think is Mr. Hughes' favourite Blur song.
It's not. It isn't. It's not working. It's even better this week.
Go and listen to song 2 because song 2 is absolutely fantastic. What's your favourite song, George?
Probably There's No Other Way. It's in their first album. So.
Hey George, I was always an Oasis man. I've got to be honest. I was always an Oasis man, like every time. I do like. I've got time for song 2. I love song 2 because it's a bit rockier for me. But yeah, they just weren't for me. Sorry.
I just find Oasis, they're sort of just the same thing every time. Rather than Blur, they do lots of different genres, don't they? I think so.
I think, yeah, Damon Albarn historically was a bit. I'll play it.
Who's playing that?
Not me.
Oh. Actually, is playing that.
Yeah.
It's not heavy. There we go. Thank you, Mr. Webb. I forgot he was there.
I think it's quite interesting when you look at what you said there, George. I think you're right that Blur were maybe a little bit more experimental. And it's quite interesting afterwards. Obviously, there's this battle of Britpop and, this kind of beef between the 2 bands. But Damon Albarn now is quite good friends, I think, with Noel Gallagher, isn't he? He said he's the only person who went through what I went through during that period of time. Hedonism, I imagine, craziness. Rightio, without further ado, we'll go on now to our next 10 questions, which is 10 questions, general knowledge, history and politics questions. So, question 1. In America, HUAC was created in 1938 to investigate alleged disloyalty and subversive activities of those suspected of having fascist or communist ties. What did HUAC stand for?
Pass, I'm not sure.
So it was the House Un-American Activities Committee. In what year did the following 3 things happen? It's the same year. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Tommy Smith and John Carlos's famous Black Power protest at the Mexico City Olympic Games. And Apollo 8 orbited the moon.
1963.
It's not, it's 1968. What document issued in 1215 at Runnymede was the first document in England to put into writing the principle that the king and his government was not above the law?
Magna Carta.
Correct, Magna Carta. Anzac Day was originally devised to commemorate what battle?
Battle of Gallipoli.
Correct. The Third Reich was the official Nazi designation for the regime in Germany from January 1933 to May 1945. But when did the Second Reich come to an end?
1918.
Correct. When was the voting age reduced from 21 to 18 in the UK?
1968.
Oh, it's close. It's 1969.
Oh.
The Rugby World Cup was first held in 1987, which is the year I was born. Which two countries co-hosted it?
Australia and New Zealand.
Correct. Who was the first Labour Prime Minister?
Clement Attlee.
No, it was Ramsay MacDonald. During the Great Leap Forward, what did Mao Zedong order to be constructed in private backyards to support China's industrial growth?
Oh, like sort of iron furnaces. Can't remember the name of them.
Yeah, it's steel furnaces.
Steel furnaces.
Mr. Hughes, you happy to give that one?
Yeah, let's give him it.
We'll give you that. And the final question. Lorica segmentata is the Latin name for what part of a Roman soldier's uniform?
The helmet.
It's not. It's the segmented armor. It's the segmented armor that they had on. That was very good.
He's got 5 on that round. So with my rudimentary maths, that gives him 13.
You are now, George, top of the leaderboard.
Well done, George.
Very well done indeed. I know that Henry Kay will be listening to this at some point.
He'll be absolutely fuming.
He is going to be fuming. Because he thought it was going to be on for kind of a tie-break mastermind quiz. We may have to get you on for like a kind of playoff style competition. We'll see how it goes in the last one. But that was fantastic, George. Good knowledge, George, and some excellent history and politics knowledge as well. So well done.
Thank you.
And thank you for taking up some of your Sunday chatting with us as well.
Oh, it's okay.
Nice one. Well, have
a lovely rest of the day, George.
Yeah, thank you.
See you later.
See you later.
Bye. Wow, so a new leader.
George Langworthy, what a man. Is it going to be controversial that I gave that last one? That's correct now. Is Henry Kay going to jump on that?
Hence why I did suggest that you said yes, correct. Because I know that Henry Kay is going to be questioning that quite a lot.
Yeah, he is, yeah. Well, as you say, maybe, because we're going to have that little coda, aren't we, at the end of the season where we get the winner on for 10 minutes. Maybe we just have a little playoff.
I like the thought of it, like a battle.
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe a House of Games style kind of quiz where we get two of them on going up against each other. Maybe something to look forward to for the future.
Absolutely.
Hello, we've got Mr. Donaldson with us now. Hello, Mr. Donaldson. How are we doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you all?
Not bad, not bad.
Very, very good. Very good. Lovely to have you back again.
I know I'm currently putting fence panels up in my garden, so I've knocked off from that to do this. It's clear.
We'll be straight back to fence panels afterwards.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what a Sunday. What a Sunday.
Mr. Hughes, I'm going to hand over to you to remind our listeners of the rules and obviously our contestants of the rules too as well.
Yeah, I'll show you the current state of play. So here we are. Exciting times. Obviously, at the moment, you can vote online in the first semi-final between Mrs. Hughes and Mr. Davis. There's an early lead. So one of the contestants has pulled ahead to get voting on Twitter. That was an epic battle between, unexpectedly, Israeli and Macmillan, I think. And I'm looking forward to see who goes through this week and actually who you've chosen, gents. Now, of course, same rules as usual. Slightly extended for the semi-final. You'll have up to 8 minutes. You don't need to take 8 minutes. You have up to 8 minutes to put forward the argument for whoever you've selected from your stable. And we'll listen, maybe ask some questions, and then put it out to the nation to vote on once again. Now, of course, this week, major historians have been interacting with our podcast at Tom Holland. So who knows how many people will be listening to this week. Probably pick up 2 or 3 more. I don't know. Anyway, so who was first? So I think it's going to be it's Phil. So Phil, Mr. Donaldson, You'll be going first. Would you like to tell us who you've selected?
I'll tell you as I go along.
Okay.
I'll tell you when my first opening gambit.
Everyone's going for this now, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's a new way of doing it. I'll just leave you hanging for a minute. So would you like me to start?
It's entirely up to you.
I love it. Okay. Mr. Donaldson, 3, 2, 1, take us away.
Prime ministers are often remembered by one or two negative events, and the rest of their achievements are forgotten. If you think of Theresa May, you always think of Brexit. You think of Cameron, you think of Brexit. You think of Gordon Brown, the financial crash. Tony Blair, the Middle East. John Major, Black Wednesday. Margaret Thatcher's unusual. She gets a positive in the Falklands, but a negative in the poll tax. Callaghan gets a winter discontent. Eden, Suez. And my man today, Edward Heath, is always remembered for the 3-day week. Sometimes it's a bit unfair. Sometimes it's not unfair to remember by these things, but actually I think in Heath's case it is. His reputation isn't good, but let's not lump him in with bad prime ministers. In fact, his 4 years are important to us. And in the last round, I did Harold Wilson, and I forgot to use my prop, which is Harold Wilson.
Oh, nice.
Or possibly Chairman Mao, depending how you look at it. It is a salt, it is a pepper shaker. And of course, with Harold Wilson's pepper shaker comes the Edward Heath salt shaker.
Oh, this is great.
That's the limit of my Cruet collection. I don't the prime ministers aren't available. They're also put together salt and pepper because for 10 years, over 5 elections between 65 and 75, they faced off as prime minister and leader of the opposition. If Margaret Thatcher is seen as a transformative figure for the late century, these two people, Wilson and Heath, born just 4 months apart, both States Grammar School and Oxford boys, are the foundations on which Margaret Thatcher was able to build. You think of Wilson, we talked last week, clever, funny, quick, not really politically principled. Using a phrase from Jim Hacker from Yes Minister, which was based often on the memoirs of people from the Wilson-Heath era, Wilson was, I think I say, the kind of man who would follow you into a revolving door and come out first. Heath was a strategist. He was highly intelligent, if at little times ponderous, slow to make up his mind, having done so, actually quite difficult to shift. A man of very strong principles, unlike Wilson, from which he would allow no deviation. Unfortunately, this sort of came across as antisocial, seemingly rude. It's quite possible, it's not been put in history books really. Nowadays, we might think he's got mild Asperger's syndrome. His disinterest in others, he'd walk away from conversations, he wasn't empathetic. There's a story of him in 1970 in the hot June election, getting out of a helicopter in his shirt sleeves. A female constituency worker offered him a pint of beer. And you can see Boris Johnson or Harold Wilson lapping that up and think, what a marvellous opportunity. Heath just went, I don't drink beer, and walked away. Friends and colleagues did say that when you knew him, he could be very kind. There's stories of him with union leaders whom we wouldn't have to associate with him round his house talking about industrial issues. And they got him to play the red flag and sing the red flag on his piano. Not the man you maybe think he is. He's a believer. And whilst his beliefs may be narrow and a hard man to shift, he was actually a pragmatist, and that's very important. We think of those as U-turns. Actually, they should be seen as sensible acceptances that things have changed and you need to change. And we see a lot of that now with a current leadership role of people dogmatically sticking to potentially failing policies and not willing to admit you might have got something wrong. He's seen as a technocrat. Private Eye referred to him as Heath Cohen, the grocer. In the current era of listening to the science and post-Trump, actually experts, technocrats, people doing things in a sensible, logical, data-driven way may not be a bad thing. He actually said, I want to see a fresh approach to the taking of decisions. The government should seek the best advice and listen carefully to it. It should not rush into decisions. It should use up-to-date techniques for assessing the situation. It should be deliberate and thorough. What is more, its decisions should be aimed at the long term, right? You can see that, relevant now. The 1970 manifesto, Heath's manifesto that gave us Heath as a policy. We haven't got Heathism, it doesn't really exist. But an economy based on more jobs, reduced and reformed taxation, including income tax, cut out unnecessary state spending, strengthening responsible trade unions, but also limiting union power, increased training opportunities for men and women, stopping nationalisation, regional development, and increased agriculture. If you put that and said that was Margaret Thatcher in 1979 or Margaret Thatcher in 1983, you wouldn't disagree. Heath is the forerunner of the things we say are the policies of Margaret Thatcher. He built on the failed policies of Barbara Castle and Harold Wilson. One of the first things they did, an industrial relations bill, Came back to bite them on the bottom later on, but quite important, clear rights and obligations for unions and employers in discussions. What's lawful, what isn't lawful. Trying to do what Heath and Castle had failed because the unions wouldn't let Labour do it. The Conservatives and Heath didn't have that problem. They laid down a code of practice for good and bargaining. What failed actually was the unions didn't play by it. The law was passed, but it was toothless in many ways. If you look up Heath, you'll see the phrase U-turns and lame duck industries, right? He actually, in cabinet papers released after his time, he said to Scottish representatives of the firms, the government could no longer put the taxpayers' money into a company whose chairman could give no indication when it would become a viable concern. Sensible policies. He wasn't propping people up. Came a point where actually realised he needed to. They had supported Harland and Wolff in Belfast and Upper Clyde shipbuilders in Glasgow, which is a really interesting story in itself. Haven't got time to go into it now, but look it up as a lock-in rather than a strike. It said he did a U-turn. He said we won't support industry, but then supported Rolls-Royce. Well, interestingly, he did support Rolls-Royce a little bit, but then they let Rolls-Royce go bust. But then we bought the company off the liquidator, so we owned it. He's quite sensible really here. He wasn't going to bail out a business that had failed and bail out the shareholders. This was a company building jets for the new range of Boeing aircraft and Lockheed aircraft. And he said, well, if we're going to make money, let Britain make money, not a failed company. So it wasn't really bailing a company out. It was a pragmatic approach. He had the most prepared government probably for a very long time. They'd only been out of office for 6 years, and many of his cabinet ministers coming in 1970 had already had experience, cabinet or ministerial. They came in with the biggest set of ready-made policies and legislation. Blair, Cameron, their governments didn't have that experience after long periods out of office. They didn't have the legacy that Heath did. So he was only there for 4 years, but 4 years he was good. The main problem Heath had was economically. His chancellor, a brilliant man called Ian MacLeod, died 5 weeks after becoming Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1970, had a heart attack at 57. Imagine if Tony Blair had lost Gordon Brown a month in, or David Cameron, George Osborne a month in, what their premierships would have been like without those pivotal economic figures. The loss of MacLeod made life difficult. He replaced him with a man called Anthony Barber. He had been financial secretary and chief secretary of the Treasury, secondary jobs in the Treasury, but in some ways he wasn't up to the job. Could have picked Reginald Maudling, a previous chancellor, but he was too associated with Macmillan. But during Barber and Heath together, they deregulated banking. They wanted people to be able to spend because it creates jobs. They created a lot of credit. It's known as the Barber boom. Bit of argument at the time between economists or someone who's done political history, Keynesian versus monetarist economics. And the problem was money expanded and it led to a bit of inflation. It wasn't that bad. We think of the 70s as a bad time of inflation. It wasn't really down to Heath as such, right? We had a problem. Inflation was already running at 5% when he came in. It had been 3 to 5 over the 60s. It got to about 9 under his first 3 years. What happened then was that the union started asking for higher pay rises, and then lo and behold, just as they wanted more money for the mines, electricity workers, gas workers, there was an Arab-Israeli war and an OPEC oil crisis, and that escalated prices even more and led to even more almost outrageous demands of 35–40% pay rises. We're quibbling now about 1% for nurses. Imagine if a union said, we want a 40% pay rise.
Final point, sir.
Well put, yeah. Not much time now. Northern Ireland. And we think of Northern Ireland, we don't think of Heath. We maybe think of the bad things. Think of Bloody Sunday. We think of internment. But actually, what people don't realise about Edward Heath is that he let his ministers talk to the IRA, the Republican side, in secret. Publicly, you don't negotiate with terrorists. Heath actually did. They brought in a thing called the Sunningdale Agreement in 1973, which is actually very similar to the Good Friday Agreement that finally came through under Blair in 1998. It didn't succeed at the time because the unionists, people like Ian Paisley, who favoured the union, feared that it allowed this power-sharing body to gain more and more power and ultimately end up with Northern Ireland becoming part of a united Ireland, and they weren't standing for that. The Good Friday Agreement with power-sharing doesn't allow it to increase its powers. But Heath tried. He realised the political solution was the way forward. And as I say, he led away for Thatcher. He also led away for Blair in Northern Ireland. But ultimately, it's Europe, when we think of Edward Heath, who, after the 3-day week, is where we come. He was in World War II, so Wilson wasn't. He was a civil servant. He was at a Nuremberg rally. And along with Labour's Roy Jenkins, he was one of the biggest advocates of Britain in Europe. He wasn't a Europhile. He didn't holiday abroad. He famously didn't speak languages. When he tried to speak French, it was fabulous comedy. Roy Jenkins loved fine wines. He loved France. You know, he was really a European. But Heath realised that a Europe that works together and trades together is less likely to go around and blow each other up. He was involved in the early 60s with Macmillan negotiating. They failed there. The French wouldn't let us in. But in the 70s, he made it his mission to let us join Europe. And
final points.
Given his issues around Brexit, it just shows actually what a visionary he was. So yes, for his manner, but don't overlook how he changed it. He lost in 1974 on a Who Governs Britain election after the three-day week. He actually got more votes than Harold Wilson. And given what he'd faced, I think the people actually said, you've done a pretty good job, but the electoral system actually just went slightly against him. That's Edward Heath and why I think he's a great Prime Minister.
A slight extra bonus bit, but very, very good. Thank you very much. Thank you. You know what? One of the questions I was going to ask you, Phil, was you've sort of really covered it, and it's an interesting one to me when you're teaching politics at the moment, that this phrase of U-turn just hangs all these negative aspects on it, when actually, as you mentioned, a U-turn can be a very sensible thing. And another thing that you mentioned, and I was going to ask you about this, whether you thought it might well be the best prepared government coming in to govern. It's something I've read in a couple of biographies of the Heath government, that this could have been one of the best prepared in terms of policy and detail of policy governments to ever come in. Well, at least in the last century, the 20th century. Sorry.
I think it comes back to the post 1970 era. The two things you've said. That I think the unions and the industry thought, well, we're too big to fail. We won't be allowed to fail. The government will bail us out. So Heath came in and said, no, we won't bail you out. And I pointed out, he didn't bail out Rolls-Royce. They let Rolls-Royce go bust. And then they bought the liquidated Rolls-Royce for the nation because it was making important stuff that could be sold. But he wasn't going to bail out the pockets of shareholders. You know, this feeling that we're too big to fail. It's the whole rationale that led to privatisation under Margaret Thatcher, that there's no incentive to become efficient if you know you'll always be bailed out. And I think I did make the point that, yes, in terms of the personnel and the policies they had laid down, they hit the ground running. They were incredibly well prepared as a government in 1970. But I think that was helped by the fact they had a lot of people in the cabinet who'd been in government, where you think about Tony Blair and David Cameron, even Harold Wilson in 1964, I think he was the only member of his cabinet who actually had cabinet experience. No one of Blair's government, or maybe had minor experience as a junior minister. I think any of the cabinet ministers, and certainly none of Cameron's in the initial stages. Although he brought one or two in later on, obviously Ken Clark and such like. But
it's often said as well that "Who governs" slogan is one of the worst ever campaign slogans. Because the obvious answer is, this is how it's framed. There's always this. Dominic Sandbrook, I think, said this, as does Andrew Marr. So he goes, "Who governs?" And there was "Not you, mate." But you point out the fact that it's not as clear cut as that in that election. It's not
it's the same as the crisis, what crisis Sun headline about Callaghan, who never actually said that. I mean, Callaghan was slightly daft in what he said, but he was probably right when Callaghan. We can't do that now, really. About we talk about being a parochial attitude. I mean, it was a bit naive, but yeah, it's true that he never called it a who governs election. In some ways, that's a retrospective viewpoint. But I mean, it was an unnecessary election in that he could have fought on. He had a majority, and he didn't need to go to the country till the middle of 1975. So to go to the country in February 74, but he was stuck. It's a nationalised industry. You run the mines, you run the electricity, you run the coal, they got all of these things, and the unions are on strike, and you're not willing to give them more money. I think he went to the country and said, well, if the people tell me that actually the unions need to shut up and go out to work, then I've got a bargaining chip to say to the unions, well, the people have spoken. Whether it would have worked, whether, again, it's a good question.
Very good. Alan, any questions from you?
So was one of his problems, do you think, the fact that he duelled with Wilson? So this idea of being he's such a strong character, Wilson. He's good with the soundbite. He's all about the personal in many respects, the common touch, whether that's constructed or reality. Do you think that's a big problem that Heath comes up against? If he came up with someone else, would it be a different story for him? Would he be remembered better?
Quite possibly. I mean, of course, Heath, I didn't mention, was the first leader of the Conservative Party chosen by the other Conservative MPs, rather than the magic circle of just the senior people, as when Churchill took over, in 39, 40, or even Eden, Macmillan, Hume, all chosen by the, whose turn is it now? So clearly Heath was popular among his own people. It's before, of course, no TV in Parliament at the time, very little TV coverage. I mean, the reality is most of the pictures of film of Heath and Wilson you've seen on Dominic Sandbrook, you've seen on the Andrew Marr.
Yeah.
The same clips come round and round again. And obviously, we don't know, he conducted orchestras, he sailed ships. He was not a man of the people by any stretch of the imagination. But then, as I said last week, neither was Wilson. Wilson gave the impression of being a man of the people with his pipe and his pint of beer. But of course, he'd have taken the pint of beer off the constituency work and drunk it with gusto on a hot June day. I'd say it's interesting. Heath's, he wasn't, the stories of him going to, sitting at constituency dinners and just talking to no one, and someone slipped him a note, said, talk to the person next to you, and he wrote a note back, said, I did. Just that sort of level of, I would think almost Asperger's in some ways.
Yeah, I read a similar story when I was just doing a little bit of research. A lot of time at dinner parties, he would often sometimes just sit there, almost ignoring the people all around him, and speaking to people perhaps at the other end of the table occasionally.
He could also cut people off. He could be his friend for 5 years and then never hear from him again. He was a very, very strange man in many ways. And then, of course, there's allegations after he died, which were frankly ridiculous. Let's not go into those now. But,
no, we'll keep away from those.
The documentary on BBC, I think it was on BBC 4. I think you can kind of watch it on YouTube as well. I know that you pointed it to me, Mr. Hughes. It's quite
the Wilson Heath one.
The Wilson
versus, that's really good. Yeah,
it's really good. But in there, it does suggest actually he could be quite personable around the right people. People he felt comfortable with. He was actually quite witty, quite funny as well. But he just kind of froze in those times where he needed to maybe be more personable as well. I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah, really good. Fantastic.
I mean, in some ways, it's Theresa May. Theresa May is the closest you get to Edward Heath in some ways. They suggest that she wasn't clubbable, that she seems not to have any ends. But people say Theresa May is actually, jolly good funny to get to know her. Around her dinner table, she's.
We'll invite her on the podcast. Say, get to know her a little bit. See what we can do. Right. Okay. Semi-final. Over to the next competitor, and here he is, headmaster of Ripon Grammar School, back again, Mr. Jonathan Webb. We've not got any photos this week. Don't worry.
Thank God. Right. Do you want me to talk?
What a start. Yeah, would you like to say who you're going to talk about, or are you doing?
Yeah, I will actually this time. I'm going to talk about a British Prime Minister who I have devoted minutes of my life researching, William Pitt the Younger. And what a revelation, actually. What a revelation.
It's a good Wikipedia page, isn't it?
Well, I have it here.
Yeah. Would you like me to say that?
Can I just say, I may not go to 8 minutes, but if I do, I'm going to steam on regardless.
You get. I've put it in. You get another 1 minute.
So don't try and stop me. Can I just say, Phil, an amazing presentation on Heath. I think a Davis Donaldson final is something to really relish. Right, do you want me to make a start?
Can I remind you, though, if you do not make it to the final, you'd have the third and fourth playoff.
You didn't tell me about that.
Yeah.
I may have to change my Prime Minister.
Oh, don't worry.
Spencer Percival.
I'm announcing a twist at the end of the show. Just wait for that. Right, okay.
Right, let me go.
3, 2, 1, off you go.
So, above the rest, majestically great, behold the infant atlas of the state, the matchless miracle of modern days, in whom Britannia to the world displays, a sight to make surrounding nations stare, a kingdom trusted to a schoolboy's care. Well, so the satire went in 1783, if Wikipedia has got anything to go by. So, well, as Prime Minister at the age of 24, it's always been, I think, really easy to ridicule Pitt the Younger, as though his youth was just merely good fortune, as though George III literally had nobody else to turn to. Of course, Edmund Blackadder, that other historical sage, famously did just that in his quip, that the next generation of rotten boroughs would produce Pitt the even younger, Pitt the embryo, I think it was, wasn't it? And Pitt, Pitt, the glint in the milkman's eye. But actually, a cursory investigation into the life of William Pitt, much like the cursory investigation I've just done this morning, reveals that Pitt actually merited his appointment. He stood above, possibly symbolically rather than physically, given the fact he was only 6 years old, his contemporaries like Lord North, Fox, Portland, et al. Pitt's premiership was no mince pie administration, like a dog only for Christmas. Yes, he was appointed at the tender age of 24 in 1783, but he actually went on to govern for 23 years and win 2 or 3 elections. Don't ask me quite how many, but quite a couple. And 2 administrations from 1783 to 1801 and 1804 to 1806. So what I want to do this week is bore you about or speculate philosophically about comparisons, the difficulty of differing social and political constructs, nor even make any bitter comparisons against other prime ministers. No. I will focus just on Pitt. Yes, he had his faults, but actually in the early 19th century, who didn't? This was no sanctimonious age. We must remember, of course, his fondness for port, a 3-bottle man, apparently, that got the better of him, dying of a peptic ulcer while in office. He was not particularly a social man, preferring to devote his life to government rather than the sort of frivolous trappings of society. Nor can, sadly, or maybe positively, I don't really know, can he lay any sort of claim to be a progenitor of children. No 16 children this week. Pitt never married. He probably was either homosexual or maybe asexual in his inclinations. He was solitary, occasionally superior, maybe a bit colourless at times, but he was a man born to serve. A man who saw his destiny as service to his country. And while he might not lay claim to the sort of great legislative achievements of, say, that other great, possibly, well, in fact, greatest British Prime Minister, Earl Grey, he was a man who understood Britain. And he was a man who, like, I suppose, the Colossus, bestride the old Britain and the new Britain, and he allowed these countries to move seamlessly between those across the generations between the 18th and early 19th centuries. He avoided the dangerous upheavals of Europe, particularly France. In short, he was an administrator of the very highest order, just the man for a crisis, just the man to negotiate perhaps a strong exit from Europe, or even a man with the financial acumen to ease the impact of a pandemic. In short, a man who cometh the hour, cometh the person. So much like the beautiful South, who let love speak up itself, let's allow Pitt to speak up himself as well. So what were his achievements? Well, he was an arch realist, realizing the fiscal limitation of the state. He was an early opponent of Britain's folly in the Americas in fighting the War of Independence. How useful would he have been as an advisor to the presidents of the United States of America in the 1960s on the follies of Vietnam? He was a Democrat. He opposed the venal corruption of the rotten boroughs, a man before his time. Yes, he was unsuccessful in trying to abolish 36 rotten boroughs, but of course he faced the prevailing attitudes of the time and the corruption of the time. But he laid the foundations of that reform movement, upon which, of course, the various acts like Grey and Disraeli were able to build. He supported the emancipation of Catholics in Ireland, worked against the Protestant ascendancy, and negotiated the Union of 1801. Let's not forget to protect the Catholic majority. He was an anti-slaver, an anti-slave campaigner, whose work helped build the coalition which led to the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, a year after his death. Had he lived, this might have been his finest achievement. A lifelong friend, of course, of a man who he met at Cambridge University, another great Pocklington leader, of course, William Wilberforce. He was honest. Pitt was a very honest man. In fact, his sobriquet was Honest Billy. He attacked the corruptions of his opponents, the corruptions of vote rigging, the corruptions of fiscal impropriety. He reformed the British East India Company. He was one of those men who did not amass a fortune. He was Britain's greatest patriot, a builder of empire, centralising rule in India, establishing Australia's penal colony, in actual fact, shipping off 778 convicts for the good of Britain. He consolidated Britain's power in the Caribbean. He built British power in Canada. And of course, he's probably his greatest achievements to tirelessly thwart the machinations of revolutionary France by forging the first and the second, and of course, the third coalitions against Jacobin and then Napoleonic France. He was fiscally astute. He introduced Britain's first income tax. Now, that might get some opponents, but I think that really did put us on a sound financial footing. He suspended the gold standard, introduced paper money, lowered tariffs, stimulated the British economy, helped balance the books, and of course provided the money to expand Britain's navy to deliver Nelson's victory at Trafalgar, but also basically seal Britain's dominance of the seas for the next 100 years. Pitt stands equal, nay, higher than Churchill in his stance. Because let's not forget, in 1805, Britain stood alone. Pitt, I think, should be seen as Britain's greatest prime minister. He built a fiscal state. He was anti-corruption. He masterminded independence against France. He built a navy. He was a liberal Tory well before his time. His life was cut tragically short, of course, while still serving as British prime minister, exhausted by his devotion to port, but also his devotion to his country. And no, I don't think he literally expired on the 23rd of January, immortally uttering the lines, "I could just do with another of Bellamy's meat pies." I think this rather priggish virgin, the daily reader of the classics, died saying, "Oh, my country, how I love my country." Yes, a country trusted to a schoolboy's care, but at 24, what a trust George III put in him. A trust never betrayed. That's it. He's amazing. Pitt the Younger, amazing.
Thank you. You know what? A little bit like you said.
Don't ask any questions.
I'm not. I'm very much like, I've got a nosebleed looking back at prime ministers from this time. But like you, and you didn't know very much about William Pitt the Younger. We've obviously read the Wikipedia page and a couple of other pages. I'm really interested in it. It's fascinating.
Can I do a book recommendation?
Go on.
This book by Linda Colley. I don't know if you've ever come across this. She's married to David Cannadine, Britain's Forging the Nation. This is, I've read this about 20 years ago. It is absolutely brilliant. And it's from this book that I got the meat pie quotation. It's a superb book.
Because the idea is they're coming just before Christmas and they're not going to last until the meat pies have all gone. Mince pie, something like that. Is that right?
Yeah.
Something like that.
That's where it becomes the mince pie. Yeah.
That's the mince pie bit. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
The thing was, he was really ill, wasn't he?
Biography alongside his Wilberforce. Haig did too. Wilberforce and Pitt companion volumes, didn't he? A few years ago.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. And Haig rated Pitt as one of the greatest prime ministers ever.
And he also said that you're right, he died the year before, obviously, the abolition of slave trade in the British Empire. And I think Haig said in that biography, I don't know if it's Wilberforce's or Pitt's, that had he been alive and had that happened, there'd be no doubt that he'd be the greatest, or right up there with the greatest.
Yeah, I mean, I think, he dies of this ulcer or expire. Oh, hello, Dan.
Hi, Dan.
Fans arrive. Stand in the cop, will you? I think, I think this ulcer sort of, it tragically cuts his life short. And had he been alive, he would have continued in office, and yes, he would have be remembered as the man who abolished the slave trade.
Yeah,
no doubt about it.
I read some mad sort of foreign adventure in Haiti as well. If you sort of came across that, which is seen as that it's sort of ultimate foreign policy disaster. That after the Haitian Revolution, the British essentially tried to take that island, I believe, and it goes dreadfully wrong.
I think it did, yes.
I'm not putting you on the spot.
No. There is this sort of terrible Haitian operation where they try and invade to sort of kick the French out, but also bolster the French planter class against the slaves. So I think there you've got Pitt acting financially and sort of building the modern nation, as opposed to being the the abolitionist. But I think I really am sort of quite inspired to read a lot more about him, actually, because he does sort of transcend this age when Britain moves from a sort of an agrarian patrician state to actually beginning to put in place that modern state. He's not a populist by any stretch of the imagination, but I think he's a liberal. He's definitely a liberal Tory, and of course politics was incredibly fluid then. So he's moving between Whigs and Tories, and of course there's all these sort of country gentlemen as well. You can't really talk about a political system at that point in time. But the one thing he did do, he sort of hated Fox, and Fox was quite a corrupt politician. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, and he refers to himself more commonly as a Whig, I think. Right, say.
Yeah, but most of the time. Yeah. Although he's sort of seen as a liberal Tory, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? He's mentioned as well that he wasn't in it for himself. I think he dies with quite a lot of debts, and the Commons agreed to write it off or pay for it. Something. Which it's interesting, the similarities in some ways between Heath and Pitt there. That it's politics first, it's administration first, family, and both obviously with discussions by both friends about their sexuality or just asexual. Interesting similarity. Yeah, good stuff. Mr. Braidwood.
Yeah, I mean, most people sort of describe him as fairly colourless, and he is a tireless administrator. I think he works himself to death, and presumably while he's working, he's also knocking back several glasses of fairly large port.
Yeah.
And the stresses and strains of that, working tireless. I mean, it's a little bit like Thatcher, really. This sort of famously getting up at sort of having 4 hours sleep. I don't think he was particularly fairly insomniac, should we say? And I think he just overworked himself into an early grave.
It reminded me differently. Not drinking, not in that way, but James K. Polk, the president, probably worked himself into an early grave, working pretty much 17, 18, 19 hours a day for one administration, and died, not long after. Yeah.
He also, I think he was Chancellor of the Exchequer as well, so he's the first Prime Minister to sort of combine the two roles.
Wow.
It's a bit of a control freak, I guess, really.
Very good.
I have nothing really to add. I thought the similarities between Heath and Pitt were very interesting there as well. The fiscal conservatism as well. That's quite interesting. The fact that you get later prime ministers building on that as well, the likes of Disraeli and so on and so forth. And it also took me back to a time when my history lessons at school were just watching Blackadder, and that's how we learned about the start of the 19th century, kind of end of the 18th century as well. And I remember that episode about the rotten boroughs very well. I think it's a classic, absolute classic Blackadder episode. I'm going to go back and watch it, I think.
Well, I think he was first elected. Sorry, I think he was first elected to a rotten borough. But and then he became, I think he was elected to the MP for Westminster, and then the University of Cambridge, which he basically held until his death.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, we've got another semi-final. I've got no idea which way this one will go. What a completely different choice you've got there. Heath versus Pitt the Younger. I love it. Absolutely brilliant. So from here, what will happen? Obviously, this one will go up at some point soon. We've got to see the results from both semi-finals. We'll then have the final, and there will be a sort of fun, very short third and fourth playoff that will be only about a 4 or 5 minute fun dash. However, I'm announcing the twist right now. Live, well, not live, it's recorded, obviously. What we're going to allow to happen, more details to follow, is when the finalists are known, you will get chance to stick or twist with your final Prime Minister. So you can choose to play the final one in the final or third or fourth playoff, or you can select from anybody who hasn't been used so far but is out in the competition. Obviously, we've got some big guns that have not been used. Churchill, Lloyd George, many others. More of that to follow. So the decision has to be made later on. Do you stick or do you twist? Anyway, Mr. Braidwood, have you got a book recommendation?
Well, first of all, we need to remind people to
like and subscribe.
Obviously like and subscribe. We already had that. But
vote on Twitter.
Yeah, vote on Twitter afterwards.
Vote on Twitter,
or let us know if you want to as well. This time I actually did get some people getting in touch with me to vote for the last one as well. So that was really good.
What's been interesting actually in the last probably 10 days or so is views on all of the episodes have gone up quite considerably in some cases.
Definitely, and that actually does link with my book recommendation as well. As you alluded to earlier on, we have been generating quite a lot of publicity thanks to our connections now, our links, with world-class historian Tom Holland and Dominic Sambrook as well.
Can I say that our usual POC history tweets might get a little bit of a reach of, let's say, a couple of dozen or so, maybe 100 at a push. Tom Holland, we tweeted Tom Holland because they're about to do a Prime Minister World Cup on their podcast too. And the tweets were having 6,000-7,000 impressions. So within an hour. So it shows the reach. One day that will be us.
Definitely, 100%. Well, I had to say, I had to go for a book recommendation, which was all of Tom Holland's books, I have to say, his history books as well. But I've gone for Rubicon and Persian Fire. So Rubicon is all about the end of the Roman Republic as well. His writing is very, very engaging. It's a story-like as well. Absolutely love it. If you know nothing about the end of the Roman Republic, about Crassus or Caesar and the whole lot, then definitely recommend that as well. I think he won the Samuel Johnson sort of history prize for it or something at the time. Persian Fire is about the Persian Wars. So Athenian democracy up against the might of the Persian Empire. Absolutely brilliant. Fantastic book. And his translation of Herodotus that he did a couple of years back as well is fantastic. Again, it's really engaging. It's kind of Herodotus a little bit brought up to the modern day. He's a big fan of Herodotus as well, hence why I also like him.
Yeah, for me, I'm obviously a very modern historian. But Robert Harris is one of my favourite authors. And when I read his Cicero trilogy, I don't know much about Roman history at all. And Tom Holland's Rubicon was the book that I went to, and it was absolutely fantastic. And in the direction of more. So it is great. It's a great author. And a friend of the podcast. Yeah, there we go. My book recommendation this week is I'm Sorry I Love You, A History of Professional Wrestling. It's not. It's this. It's my favourite small one volume history of a president, and it's Lyndon B. Johnson, An American Liberalism by Bruce J. Schulman. It hasn't been beaten. A couple of 100 pages. It's a history of LBJ, but it's also a history of the American liberal tradition. It's absolutely fantastic. Would highly recommend anybody interested in liberalism or the American presidency.
I read a story the other day about LBJ. When Nixon became president, he was flying home, to his ranch, and he started smoking again, apparently.
Yeah. Poor Lyndon. After Nixon won, he didn't look after himself very well at all. He smoked a lot. He always loved his Cutty Sark whiskey, but that consumption went up a great deal as well. Because he knew he wasn't going to live long. He always knew he wasn't going to live a long life, didn't Lyndon Johnson? And he thought, well, what's the point of prolonging it? I'm going to enjoy it on my ranch. Yeah.
It's taken a bit of a sad turn there. I didn't mean it.
Yeah. Let's go back to this book. This is a great history of professional wrestling.
Have we got any more book recommendations? I remember last time we had the kind of absolute flood of books.
Yes, I will say the one I'm reading at the moment. It's a different kind of history book again, because despite being a politics teacher, I'm more of a social historian. It's called Scoff, Scoff, by Penn Vogler. Good name. It's a history of class and food in Britain. Talks about eating at lunch, dinner, tea, and things like that, but also the history of canned food, history of roast beef. Fun question. Who was the first person to sell Heinz beans in the UK?
Was it Fortnum and Mason?
It was a luxury product.
Nice.
We think of canned food as being cheap. So great. Scoff by Penn Vogler. It's quite small chapters on lots of areas, but a history of Britain's social class and food.
Awesome.
That's good. That sounds really good. Anything else? No.
Anything else?
Don't mind.
Oh, we've got to do music, haven't we? I forgot about that.
Yeah, I was waiting for you there.
Sorry.
Which, to be fair, we probably will be awkwardly sitting in silence anyway when YouTube won't let us play the music. So
we can all dance.
Well, at the start of the show, we talked about in 1812. Today was the day in 1812 Congress authorises war bonds in preparation for the War of 1812. So I've gone for an obvious choice. I've gone for the Star Spangled Banner, obviously lyrics. Just in the chat, I'm hoping it's going to play. I've gone for a really obscure version of it, just from YouTube.
Overture.
Oh yeah, I could have done that. Yeah. Poet Francis Scott obviously wrote the lyrics in 1814 after witnessing bombardment of Fort McHenry in Baltimore by the Royal Navy. So let's go for this. Let's go for the Star Spangled Banner and see if we're blocked by YouTube on this too. Right, here we go. The anticipation. An average version, I've got to be honest.
Can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red.
Well, we all know that one. Let's see if it plays. It reminds me of being in DC at the Verizon Centre. Is it the Verizon Centre now? What's it now?
Yeah, I think it's the Verizon Centre
Yeah.
now. It does change when we go every kind of year, doesn't it? But what it reminds me of is being in the Smithsonian, in the American History Museum with the Star Spangled Banner there.
Yeah.
That is the actual one, isn't it, as well? Like the famous Star Spangled Banner. I didn't realise that until the third time we'd been, and I was like, oh, it's the real one. I just thought it was just a flag.
And on that insight,
on American patriotism there.
It's also the real Apollo 11, you know, as well, Mr. Braidwood.
Is it? Rightio. Thank you for joining us once again. So that is our second semi-final now, all done. It's I, like Mr. Hughes, I can't call it, to be honest with you. So we'll see who's in the final and who is in our third and fourth playoff. Yeah, next week, join us for our final. We may even have another Mastermind challenger as well, or we might have a head-to-head with. Oh, it won't even be a head-to-head. It'll be a three-way.
Yeah, three-way dance.
Three-way dance, definitely. And that will be also our final episode of the season as well.
With a short coda to follow.
With a short coda to follow, but kind of the end of season one.
End of season one.
Please do join us for that. Remember to like and subscribe.
Like, subscribe. What else did she say? Let's do something. Oh, post notifications. Turn them on.
Post notifications so you know when the videos are coming. Like and subscribe and all that stuff. Gents, enjoy your weekend.
Have a lovely Sunday.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.